welcome back to Psychedelics today. Really excited to have Dr. Rachel Harris here, author of Listening to Ayahuasca, and just recently published a new book, Swimming with the Sacred. So welcome to the show, Rachel.
Thank you, Kyle. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. Could you give a little bit of an introduction on who you are and maybe how you got involved in the psychedelic world?
That goes pretty far back. Let's just say when I graduated from college in 1968, possibly before you were born.
Definitely.
Yeah, thank you. I went right from college, age 21, to the Esalen residential program. So,
Cool.
so cool. So I was very young, and that program was 5, 6 months long, and it was 40, 50 hours a week with a group of 11 people. And we worked with the top workshop leaders and therapists who were presenting at Esalen during those early days. And let me just say there were plenty of entheogens around, although at that point we called them drugs or psychedelics. And we had good quality. That was, I was well connected there. And then after those 5, 6 months, I remained on the staff on the massage crew. And I really wasn't ready to return back to the world. I mean, I was hardly ready to enter the world anyway, because by then I was like now 22 and I had no idea what I was doing. But back then it was very intense, and Esalen had no idea or concern about integrating experiences. And so that's some of my interest and concern about integration after intense experiences. And the psychedelics were not part of the official program. It was just what we did socially. And back then, we did it with a spiritual, psychological um, focus, but out in nature. So we weren't using the protocol that's used these days in the research studies and by the women underground practitioners, where you're lying down under a blanket with earphones and eye shades and you're turned inward. And we weren't aware of that possibility back then. So I mean, the interesting thing is when I started the book, I was starting to write, and all of a sudden I realized I have not experienced what these guides do. I thought I
Right.
was experienced, but I hadn't really done that protocol. So I asked, one of the women elders to do a journey with me, and we did an MDMA journey that was in that same protocol. And it's different, and no question. I mean, it's really quite different.
Well, and that's like a really interesting thing to kind of consider. And I mentioned this on the podcast in the past, just like for most people that probably have an interest in psychedelics, like being really honest in like how we got involved in it and what our experiences were. And I could imagine a lot of people that are in the psychedelic therapy space probably haven't had much exposure to an actual psychedelic therapy session, right? It's I think most people are probably experimenting first right off the bat, like in the woods with friends,
Yeah, right.
in
In
different
the woods, on the
contexts.
mountaintop.
Yeah.
Yeah,
How is that different to you
I know
then?
it's very hard to, I was going there. It's very hard to say exactly how it was different, except one way that's very obvious as I love those, the time when you're sort of coming back down, and it's a very delicate putting yourself back together time, and you want to do so consciously. And for probably an hour while I was still lying down under a blanket, my guide did a lot of clearing and cleansing energy work with, eagle feathers and different scents and plants. And it was a whole hour. It was the best I've ever experienced. And it was wonderful because the truth was, um, MDMA, I thought, this will be fun. I'd done almost 20 years of ayahuasca. That was getting a little, it's so hard. And I thought, oh, ecstasy, this will be great. Well, I went right to the ayahuasca space and I worked on dying, even though I don't have a terminal diagnosis. I don't know, that's what came up. So it wasn't exactly a fun journey. It was a tough one.
Right.
And as most ayahuasca spaces are challenging. And it was, it had certainly benefits, but it was not what I'd call, heart opening and fun. And so her clearing out really helped me come back in a lovely way. And even though it is wonderful to be in nature, you don't get the same caring and being in a relationship and someone's energy field who's taking care of you. And that was therapeutic for me.
Yeah, right. To have somebody there with you, witnessing, hearing maybe what you're going through. It's like, yeah, you don't always get that maybe with when you're with a friend or you're just out and, doing it by
And they've
yourself.
got
Like
their
there's
own thing
something so
going on.
therapeutic.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Right.
So that's like really interesting to hear you say, you have over 20 years of experience with ayahuasca, but the MDMA was also very maybe, going into these death realms, but maybe also a little bit
I
of
was so
ayahuasca like.
disappointed. Yes.
How do you conceptualize that?
You
Because
know,
I
I
do hear that. I always think about like spacing on his name. But he wrote the book Ayahuasca in My Blood, Sapo in My Blood. But that
this is
concept
that's
that
my
like
favorite book title. I can't remember the author either, but it's my
I want to say
favorite.
I want yeah Richard Gorman, and I always I think it's Richard Gorman. And I always confuse it with Richard Grossman. But
I'm
that
not
concept of like once we work with the medicines, it's always there, and can we get back in those states with other things too?
Yeah, I did ketamine, because a year or two later in my research, I did a ketamine session at a clinic, totally legal, with a doctor and a therapist present, and that went to a very different space. That went to clearly different ketamine worlds that are pretty much out of the body in a way. So that was quite different. So I don't know, but I have spoken to other people who did even mushrooms or LSD, took them to an ayahuasca place if they had worked a long time with ayahuasca. So it's sort of like the path is well worn. I know how to get there. And so that's what happened. Um, yeah, and the ayahuasca space is unique in its own way. But these women elders work with all the different medicines at all different dosage levels, and they really know the territory because they have taken a lot of drugs. I mean, I don't know a better way to put it. They're very experienced. And because they've been working for 20, 30, 40 years, so a lot of them did many different medicines in the 60s and 70s. And this is really a challenge for new psychedelic therapists, is how do you get this kind of extensive experience so that you really do know the territory well, so that you can sort of go with the person wherever they're going. Because as a therapist sitting there, you have very little cues because the person is under blanket with earphones. You're not seeing much of them. They've got eye
Right.
shades on, and people don't always say much during a journey. So how do you know what's going on inside of them? And because the elder women are so experienced, they kind of intuitively can travel with you, and they know the territory so well that they kind of have an intuitive. Many of them use the phrase, excuse me, "I know in my bones."
Yeah.
So it's the somatic-based intuition, and so they could kind of follow and go with the person.
That's really interesting. And yeah, just coming from like the scientific world, like how do we trust that? How do we measure that? Right. I always think about this like push and pull between logic and intuition. And sometimes we do have those deeply, like, yeah, we can feel it in our bones, right? It's a feeling that's so deep and we know. But sometimes our Western mind goes, well, how do we really know that? And try to
Yes,
bring
the
logic
Western
into it.
mind, if we can't measure it, it's not even real.
Yeah.
I think one of my chapter titles is a psychedelic way of knowing. It's a different way of knowing. And because we grow up embedded in a Western materialistic world, and then to whatever extent we're scientifically trained, we're really attached to a materialistic worldview. And it's quite a leap to get to the other side. And that's where the women are. And they really trust their intuitive sense, but also they've had years of experience and bouncing their intuition off of other people. For instance, the women were trained in lots of different ways, but one of the women was trained with a Shipipo shaman. So that's at the end, after 6 years of studying, okay? I don't know a psychedelic therapist who's training for 6 years. 6 years of studying, the Shipipo shaman says to her, "You're ready to sing." She says, "No, I'm not ready." Another year, and during that year, she's sitting, an apprenticeship is at the elbow. She's sitting at the shaman's elbow, and he's singing, and she's singing a nanosecond right behind him. And then, so they're there and they're able to say, "I see this in that person. Do you see that?" So they're getting some confirmation. So this is a different kind of scientific approach where you're getting inter-rater reliability. It would be what it would be called in terms of research, but you're checking out your perceptions. And as therapists, hopefully we get some of this with supervision, but even then it's hard to get live supervision,
Right.
where it's through a one-way mirror, or we used to do tapes of sessions. It's not the same as sitting at the elbow during a ceremony, let's face it. So these women have had extraordinary experience behind them, and it's hard for me. I kind of want to say to the newly had psychedelic therapists, "Well, get this experience," but it's very hard, and they're not going to wait 6 years before practicing. So there's such a need for them. And I can't, in every podcast, I mean, you'll laugh at this, I can't say, "Go do a lot of drugs."
Right.
That is part, I'm trying to be more elegant about this. That's part of the elder women's experience, is they really
Yeah.
know the territory.
Yeah.
And they've had these apprenticeships. And, one woman apprenticed with Leo Zeff. And
Oh, wow.
I recommend reading The Secret Chief
Yep.
Revised, because he was a Jungian therapist in San Francisco in the late 50s. And when he discovered psychedelics, he came out of retirement to work with patients. And so, she had that experience working with one of the elders. She's now turning 90. I've been saying she's in her late 80s, but I lost track of years, and she's turning 90.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, it's super cool. I want to come back to this topic just around training experience, but I realized we just jumped completely in to this conversation, and maybe we
That's
didn't give
fine.
it. Yeah. Yeah. No, I love it. I love it.
Back up.
But yeah, let's just back up a little bit and can you give a quick little intro of Swimming with the Sacred and what this book is all about? I know you've interviewed, what was it, 13 underground kind of
I
guides,
interviewed
medicine
15,
holders?
15
15.
who met the criteria of at least 20 years, and many of them much more. And then I interviewed sort of an auxiliary group. A couple had 10 years experience, and other people were different kind of qualifications. So I did interview more people, but the focus was on the women elders, and that was an N of 15. And I have both a clinical and a research background. So I was very comfortable in this kind of, it's a qualitative study, but I spent a lot of time with the women. Some women, I moved into their homes. I stayed for long weekends.
Wow.
Others, I went back again and again, in-person interviews, follow-up telephone calls. So it was, and I've spent my life listening to people, so I'm not a bad interviewer.
Right.
And and also, I took extensive notes, because I just didn't have it in me to ask these women if I could record them, because they're talking about illegal behavior.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm the first person they ever talked to. They had a vow of silence. So what happened was the listening to ayahuasca book kind of it connected me to some of these women. And they trusted me because they liked that book. And so they were willing to talk to me and connect me to their colleagues.
Amazing. And where did you get this idea to want to interview these women?
I can't even remember. And I think, I'm sort of losing my memory, but I think it came out of, how things come out of relationship, and everything's
Yeah.
about relationship. It came out of a friendship I was developing with one of the women who's been working a very long time. And as she began to connect me, these women function in psychedelic ways of knowing. That's not the same as writing 300 pages. It's a different kind of brain. And so they kept saying to me, well, why didn't you go in this direction? You were in many of the same places in the 60s and early 70s. Why didn't you train to do this work? And instead of going to graduate school. And it's because these women are afraid of nothing.
Mm,
And I'm afraid of everything.
right.
But I wasn't afraid of graduate school. So that's what I did. And when you get your PhD, you learn that you can write a lot of pages.
Right.
I don't know if you learn much of anything else, but you can churn out the pages. And so I was a scribe. I knew my lane. And they are really a different, they are spiritual warriors. And I'm more of a warrior. you know, I don't, when I was asking one woman about, dosages, she said, "Oh, the lighter dosages, not microdosing, but just the easier dosages, they're very interesting because you can talk, you have more memory coming back." And then she pauses and she says, "But I like to fly." So I would never say that. So I had such high regard for these women and their courage and the risks that they took to do this work. And they said, you know, after it had helped them so much, they worked on their own healing for years. I mean, that's really what the first 5, 6 years are about, their own healing. They said it was so helpful to me. How could I not share and offer this to other people?
Right. It is really important work, and I'm glad they're out there. And I'm glad that you were able to capture these stories. Like, I can't think of any other book that is out there right now that's actually solely focused on women in the space and hearing their stories and how they're showing up to the work. So this is a very special book. I think it's going to contribute a
Thank
lot to the community. I didn't get through the whole thing. I was skimming through it a little bit. It kind of came late on my desk,
you.
but I'm excited to really dig into it in the next
Yeah.
few weeks.
Yeah, as I was working on it, I felt these women voices cannot be lost.
Yeah.
And the research teams are not seeking them out when they should. And so in some ways, I felt I was writing a little bit of a historic document. It's not a how-to book. It's a book about the depth of these women and the way they hold the medicines in the world and in their work. And it's quite different from the research teams at this point. The medicalization is quite different.
Yeah, and why do you think that is? That like research isn't seeking them out? Is it too much on the quote like woo-woo side that it's too much
Because
for
the research
science?
teams are mostly men.
Mm.
Okay? I'm old. I'll say anything.
I like it. Yeah.
But I think that's really a part of the truth because I know there are enough connections in the psychedelic community that the research teams could have connected with these women. There actually is one of the women who's been training psychedelic therapists who are working on a research team somewhere in the world. I won't say where. And she's someone who has been able to make that leap from the underground to working with some scientists. She's the only one. And before I wrote the Listening to Ayahuasca book, I wrote an article on some qualitative research that I had done just on 81 people who had used ayahuasca once in North America. It's in the Journal of Psychoactive Drugs, Journal of Psychoactive Drugs, 2012. And I did what I was taught as a researcher. I was in a medical school academic research setting for a decade. And that is that I contacted experts when I developed the questionnaire. One of the experts was one of these underground women who I've known, of course, for more than 20 some years now. And I asked her, what should I ask about these people's experience? And she only gave me one suggestion. She said, ask them if they have an ongoing relationship with the spirit of ayahuasca. Well, what blew my mind in that study was three-quarters of those people, three-quarters, 75% of 81 people said yes. They had an ongoing relationship. And these women elders have relationships with the different medicines. Some of them have my medicine, my favorite medicine, but they,
Right.
over the years and with working with these medicines in such in-depth ways, they have ongoing relationships with these medicines. I can't say that's true of the research teams.
Right.
So it's a big difference.
Well, and I guess like what does that mean to have a relationship with the medicine? I remember I was talking to a teacher of mine many, many years ago during my undergrad, and we were talking about the future of psychedelics, and he brought this up. He's like, I'm curious how it's going to evolve in the Western society because we don't have relationship with the natural world. And for many indigenous cultures, they had a relationship with these medicines and it was
Yes.
ongoing.
Yes, that's
And
a
it's like, we
smart
don't think about
reflection.
that because it's like maybe, again, like too woo woo. Like, how do you have a relationship with these things? What does a relationship even mean? Um,
Right, with a plant spirit, no less. And I kind of use the anthropological term of unseen others. Well, that's not going to get very far in a scientific
right.
research study, unseen others. Um, yeah, it's a different cosmology. It's a different ontology and sense of reality. And these women really live in both worlds. And
Yeah.
I don't have a foot firmly planted in that woo woo world. I mean, I'm a Westerner, and they are too, but they've made the leap. But I'm making progress. I could say that about myself. I'm certainly much more open and in less ontological shock about really.
Right. Well, in your 20 years of ayahuasca, like, do you feel like you've had a relationship with
Oh,
ayahuasca?
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that book was written with her help.
Mm, mm.
Listening to ayahuasca book, I had a lot of help. I didn't have that help with this book. Evidently, she wasn't interested in helping with this book. Yeah, but I had a lot of help with that book.
And what was it like to develop a relationship with ayahuasca? For those that are listening and they're still curious, like,
I
I don't know if
know.
you want to get into something personal like that, but
Oh, sure. I've had people tell me I'm being called by the spirit of ayahuasca. I haven't been to a ceremony yet, but I feel her calling me. So they're beginning a relationship with the plant spirit before they've even taken the medicine. So it's kind of, this is a big range of experiences. Um, and after I finished the book, then I went back and did a long weekend of ceremonies, and I felt like I was coming home.
mm,
That oh, I'm back, and I had this vision um, of my fingerprint, and I thought, oh, she's getting the right file on me.
mm,
She's identifying me. I'm back. I've been gone for 4 years while writing this book, and now I'm back, and she's identifying me. So I felt like reconnected. I mean, I could be reconnected with the FBI in a similar way, but it did feel like a coming home,
yeah, yeah, it's interesting, and it is interesting to hear when people feel like they're being called by something.
isn't it?
And I definitely had that early on, and it felt like ayahuasca called to me for about 10 years before I even tried it. And every time I tried to engage with it, I'd always get this message, not now. And then I found out like the ceremony either like kind of went to shit or some weird stuff happened. And it was like, really start to build up. And then when I finally was able to engage with it, it was like a homecoming. It was like, oh, I've been kind of nurturing this relationship for so long. I'm actually glad I listened to it, because then I felt like I developed a bunch of skills to really be with her a little bit more.
Right,
And
right.
it's interesting. It's really
Yeah, isn't that
interesting.
amazing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So after doing all these interviews and spending time, and I'm sure there's tons of takeaways, but what can the scientific community learn from the underground, or what can we as this, people in the psychedelic space really learn from these underground elders that have been doing this for so long and probably kind of operating outside of what's being taught in psychedelic therapy training programs?
Yes, they're not therapists. When I started, I thought they were therapists. They're not. There were, I think, two. one was a PhD licensed therapist and one was a master's level. But the rest were really, and they kept, and that was totally separate. Their underground work was totally separate from their private practices. And they are not therapists. If you do a journey with one of them and you have a lot of stuff comes up that you want to talk about, they'll refer you.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's not like, oh, come in and talk about it like, a therapist would.
Yeah. And why
Or
was that? Why would they refer out? Just knowing that their own
because
scope
they're
and
not therapists. They're not interested in that personal history. They're interested in transformation. They want to see that you're fulfilling your purpose, your calling in the world. They want to see what are you receiving from this journey that you can bring back into the community and make a difference in the world. And they have a much bigger vision of the work with these medicines than, the research teams are all about reducing symptomatology. So it's, for specific diagnosis, reducing the symptoms, and so that you score differently on a on a diagnostic test. And we need that. I mean, people are suffering. But
right.
the women elders work very differently. And here's I like this quote from the eldest of the elders. And there's always this emphasis on your intention as part of the preparation. And she says, "We are responsible for our intentions and our choices, responsible to ourselves and to humanity." That's a much bigger vision.
Yeah.
That's a really different perspective. And she was the one who said, even if these medicines became legal, I would continue to work underground because that's where the sacred container is. So this is a really different perspective. And I think what will legitimately happen over time is that there will be many different ways to use these medicines. And sometimes it will be for the reduction of suffering, symptom reduction. And sometimes it will be for psychospiritual evolution
Yeah.
and for um, guidance in life and your purpose in the world. And in those kinds of big visionary sort of ways, people come in maybe once a year to work with one of these elders, or
Right.
they come in with their partner or their children, their adult children, or a parent. I mean, I've sat in ayahuasca ceremonies with three generations of a family, and it's just wonderful to know just on behalf of that family that they're working together like that. And so it's a whole different way of working with the medicines where they become a part of your life.
Mm.
And Albert Hoffman, who synthesized LSD 25, he lived to be 102. When he was 97, he did an acid trip. you know, I don't know if I'm
Amazing.
going to make
Yeah.
97 or remember to do an acid trip. So you get a sense of,
Right.
oh, these medicines can be used over the whole expanse of a lifetime, not as children, but as the adult lifespan. And they are legitimately a preparation for death and dying. And they have been used that way for centuries, back in the Eleusinian mysteries. I mean, this was preparation to die before you die.
Yeah, and that is actually what turned me on to psychedelics. I forget if you know part of my story, but had a near-death experience when I was 16,
Yes, I
and
remember.
then had an experience with psilocybin that had me revisit that. And I was so blown away. How could you ingest? And I remember I came out of that going, how could you ingest something that grows from the earth that could replicate death all over again? And that
Yes.
just like blew my mind. And I was listening to a podcast last night, one that you just recently did. I forget the podcast, The Sacred Work, with the Jungian.
John Price.
John Price, a
Yeah.
wonderful podcast. But you brought up this concept that Anne Shulgin brought up around, and I forget the term, around the death space or the death gate,
The
uh,
death door. She called
death
it the
door.
death door. Do not go through the death door. She did when she did her. And Anne Shulgin was married to Sasha Shulgin, who was the chemist who developed MDMA and that sort. So this is a renowned historical couple. She passed away a little over a year ago. But when she did her intake, all the underground elders do extensive medical screening, and they have doctors that they can consult with and refer to. So they're very, very careful. And I tell people, do not go into a ceremony or a journey unless you've been really carefully medically screened. If the person you're going to doesn't do that, that's a warning sign.
Yeah.
Um, but she would do preparation sessions, and that was part of the agreement. Do not go through the death door, because her experience was that there are opportunities to die during a psychedelic journey.
And that's fascinating. And it's like every time I think I've taken a psychedelic, especially in my younger years, I would go back to that kind of death door. And that was always the fear of maybe I'll never come back because I'm so familiar with this space after my near
Right.
death experience. And it was just really interesting to hear you mention that from Anne. And it's like, I was always curious about that. And it's interesting somebody else kind of
Yeah.
like had that concept.
Well, it kind of confirms this is real. What you're
Right.
experiencing is real. It's not just you, it's not just your experience. This is a real thing.
Yeah. And it makes me wonder with some of those like, random, maybe not so random, but deaths that happen. I've heard about some of these deaths, maybe some older folks that are in
Yeah.
ceremonies, physically healthy, they check all the boxes. And then I was always wondering about that. It's like, do you
Yeah.
reach a
It's
state
interesting.
where your soul, your psyche just wants to leave? You kind of enter into that
It
state and
can.
go,
Yeah.
okay, I'm just going to stay here.
Yeah. Well, it's very sobering, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me more curious around, obviously the whole realm of transpersonal psychology. What is soul? What is psyche? What is spirit?
So many mysteries.
Where do we go when we're on these
I know.
substances? And
I know. Yeah. But this is really important because our culture y- doesn't affirm and confirm your experience. So it's very important that we talk about this, because who, who do you talk to about these unusual experiences? And this is a whole different way of knowing. And that's where these women live. They have a whole different way of being in the world and understanding existential experiences. And you've had a big one. And it's hard to find someone who acknowledges it and says, yes, that's real.
yeah, I think the first time I really felt acknowledged was when I met one of my teachers in my undergrad, and he said, because I was sharing this story so much with everybody, and I couldn't really find support. And he said, if you lived in a traditional culture, society, the
Yes.
elders would have stepped in and taught you this new way of seeing and being in the world. But you don't. And so you had to figure it out on your own. And I was like, and it's been challenging. It's been challenging. So, like, it's like, how do people find these elders, right? And like, I wish I came across them a little bit earlier in life, but a lot of them do hang out in the undergrounds and don't really come out. And so, where do people find, like, how do you get these experiences with apprenticing with some of these folks?
Right. It is all who you know. It's like, the
Yeah.
teacher you will appear when you're
Yeah.
ready. But look at your history and the number of teachers that you've had who have had
Oh
such a
my
big
gosh.
influence on you. So
Yeah.
it does happen. And you have to search.
Yeah, yeah. And I want to come back to just like that concept of like training. And this has been coming up actually all week, just around how the psychedelic field is evolving and how the demand for psychedelic therapies, and whether that's in the underground, above ground, if you want to call it psychedelic therapy, facilitation guides, there's a huge need for people that are trained in this. And there's very limited, opportunities to really get that type of training. And people really want to rush it, right? It's like, we have a training program. We're really trying to teach psychedelic harm reduction, integration, and help people really understand how to work with clients from that perspective, and not really trying to do any of the facilitation training. Because, I come from that belief. This takes years. This
Yeah.
takes years. And it kind of conflicts with kind of like, the society that we live in, and also the demand that's going to be needed, right? Like Oregon just
I know.
legalized. There's
I
like
know.
no service centers up. People are wanting it. It's now a bill. And then it's like, how do we do this in a really integral way where we're not possibly causing harm? And yeah, people don't have tons of experience with a lot of
Right.
this stuff.
Right. Right. And a lot of the therapists don't really have much therapy. I'm sorry, I can hardly get the words out.
Yeah.
They don't have much therapy, just straight therapy experience. They're not very experienced. That, I think some of the requirements might be 5 years of work as a licensed therapist. That's not really all that much. So I know a number of therapists who have been working about 20 years as straight therapists, and now they're beginning to move into psychedelic realms. Well, they've got a good foundation, and they know enough that, let me tell you, they are working on themselves with the medicines. They are finding ways to sit in ceremony and to work, and so they are the ones finding the elders.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you got to
Yes, it
just go
takes.
out and find them and just
But,
like,
and I try and console myself because I've been a little worried. So someone said it was like the Wild West out there, and it is, and it's a little scary. But, if you're looking for if you're wanting to enter into psychotherapy with someone in private practice, there's a whole array of people who you can go to. And some of them are crappy and some of them are amazing. And so it's going to be the same.
totally. Yeah.
And some of
Um,
them will harm you. It's not just that they're crappy, but some will actually do harm.
right. And yeah, how many abuse cases or sexual boundary cases come up in just regular therapy? That's the, regulated field, and you have a board to report to versus,
Right,
in the
right,
underground, people have a really hard time trying to navigate that. It's like, who do I go
right,
to?
right.
So I heard you say that only two of these women elders that you interviewed had therapy backgrounds, and I think I saw in your book that three or two of them were actually Groff trained as well. They studied under Groff in holotropic
At
breathwork.
least, at
Yeah.
least, yeah. And
Um,
also worked with Ralph Metzner.
yes, I
Other
saw a lot of people with that. That's so cool. He was
So,
definitely one of my
that's Dan
idols.
Groff and Ralph Metzner were influenced a lot of
Yes.
people.
Yeah, yeah. So you being trained as a psychologist and a therapist and having a practice for a while, and then seeing these folks work in a totally different way, like how do you really kind of view the difference between like, this therapeutic approach versus this more transformational approach?
That's exactly
Um,
right.
yeah.
Did you read the story in the first chapter with Connie Grouds? She's got, if you Grauds, she's got a number of books on Amazon. She's a pharmacist who trained with a shaman. She's never worked underground. She takes people into the jungle for an experience of nature. But she's a friend of mine.
Oh,
And
cool.
I was asking her, we were at another friend's place, and I was asking her the usual therapy questions about, childhood histories and trauma. And, I was being a psychologist because it's, what else can I be? And my experience, and I write about this, is that she got right up in my face, like inches nose to nose, and screamed at me at the top of her lungs and said something like, it's not about personal history, it's about transformation. And I backed off and shut up. I mean, and then later in the day, she left, and I asked my friend, I said, "Did Connie yell at me?" My friend said, "No, she never yelled at you." "What do you mean?" I said, "Did she get up in my face and yell at me?" She said, "No, nothing like that happened." So it was like a shamanic intervention of energy, and I experienced it as being yelled at. And it kind of shocked me out of my psychological mode and into a real understanding of transformation happens that is a totally different process. And as therapists, we have to get out of the way of that process. We don't want to screw that up. We don't want to
Right.
interfere with it, which we tend to do. Well, tell
Right.
me more about that. Well, sometimes it's better not to talk about it. And and I've had people say, well, this is from a Jungian analyst friend of mine. So, he's had a lifetime of therapy, his own Jungian analysis. And he said this was an ayahuasca ceremony, that just the issues with his father disappeared. They were just gone. Now, as a therapist, we might want to say, well, what do you mean by that? Are they really gone? You really have no residual anger at your father for that? So you don't want to mess with that. And this, because this is a friend of mine, I know it's this has lasted. It's not even about forgiveness. It's about that trauma is no longer present in his system. Now that's transformation. We don't know how to do that in a therapy office,
Right.
but we do have to learn how to not screw it up. So we do have, as therapists, we have to know that there are different levels of work, and we have to be able to recognize it. We have to be able to recognize those different levels and respond differently to clients.
And it's so interesting. And I've had two experiences where I was really kind of thinking about this. One was at a retreat a number of years ago. And, my inclination was, okay, how do I get this person down, back on the mat, eye shades, and doing kind of like, that protocol. I remember I checked in with them and I said, how's it going? What's going on? Do you want to get back to, they looked at me and said, you know what? I'm at the point in my life where I'm just kind of sick of processing this stuff. I want to just connect with people and be happy. And it really got me thinking. It's like, how much do we keep ripping that Band-Aid off of people?
Right.
And I had a
Yeah.
friend say the same thing. They did years and years and years of therapy, and they got so sick of ripping that Band-Aid off and opening that wound up. They said, I'm at a place where I'm fine, and I don't want to keep rehashing that.
Hmm.
And it's really interesting to think about, like, yeah, as therapists, it's like we want to go deeper, right? It's like, let's just keep peeling the onion layers back, but
Right,
also
right. You're
thinking
in denial.
about, yeah, and it's like, when is it okay that the work, quote unquote, stops? I mean, the work never stops, but when is it okay to just say, you know what, I'm okay with this part of my narrative, I'm okay with this wound, and I want to just like move on from it, instead of
Right.
being like, well, no, there might be more work there. It's like, when do you know when to just hang up the
When is
phone, for
when is
example?
enough enough?
Yeah,
Very
yeah.
good question. It's a great question. And so then it means looking at what the women look at in the after the ceremony. It how is that person's, how are his relationships or her relationships? How is what's his relational capacity in the world? What is he actually doing in terms of living his purpose in life? And and what is his contribution?
Yeah.
And and so there can still be a wound under there,
Right.
but his relationships are rich and reciprocal, and he's living his best life, as Oprah, I think, says, and making a contribution. I mean, I think this is the challenge for all of us, how to live up to our personal calling. What are we here for?
Yeah. And sometimes that's hard and scary. And trying to move into that it can be really anxiety provoking. Something else this conversation is coming up for me as a question. I've been thinking about this a lot in the past few years. Is, how will, or if it will, psychedelics, transpersonal kind of experiences shape and influence the field of psychology, right? Like, I think about this all the time, being trained as a therapist, but also not always aligning in how therapy operates, because I think I've just been in the transpersonal world for so long, and maybe that's
Yeah,
my
right.
bias, where I'm
Yeah.
like, again, I'm not too sure how helpful a lot of those like programs or tools are. Sometimes they're great, right? But other times it's like, what's beyond psychology, regular therapy and counseling? And does transpersonal psychology or those experiences in psychedelics, will that help evolve the field at all? And does the field of psychology need to be evolved? And I always come back to Hillman. He says, if you take the etymology of psychology, the study of the soul, psychology has just moved so far away from it. It's like we need to bring psyche back into the field of study, and we just completely ignore it. So, yeah, I don't know. I just always I wonder about this often.
Right, right. Yeah, I really think the psychedelics will revamp psychiatry because we've gotten a little disillusioned with the SSRIs for depression. We realized that even some of the original research wasn't so great on them, and that they do stop working, and there are side effects. Um, And so I think we will have very different ways of working with depression and anxiety and the demoralization of facing death. I think we will have legitimately revolutionary ways of working with people. You know, here's the problem. In the 60s, when we, came back from our respective journeys, we're at Esalen, it's beautiful, we're high a lot of the time. We think this is going to change the world, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, that didn't exactly happen, did it? And sometimes I think my generation is just we've just screwed everything up. I mean, I think we're
Mm.
to blame for a lot of things.
You're doing
And
the best that you can in the waters that you're swimming in, right? My
well,
generation is probably going to screw things up too, and the younger generation will be like, those freaking
what a mess
millennials.
we left it. So, I was with one of my friends in the psychedelic community, and we were sort of saying, if you're a jerk before psychedelics, you could very well be a jerk after psychedelics. We
Totally.
had someone
Yeah.
in particular in mind we were thinking of. And so we have to be realistic. It's not like the world is going to change and, it's like the Beatles song, we're all going to live in peace. I don't know what's going to happen long term, but this is what I mean by the women elders have a really different perspective. And so I think there will be a whole array of different ways of working with these medicines, and I don't want to lose the this underground sacred approach.
Right. Yeah. And, I think about what's happening across different states when Oregon made their decision to legalize psilocybin and they took it outside the medical context. I know there's a lot of different kind of like opinions about it, of like having people that like aren't clinically trained facilitating,
Well,
but
they
there's
they
also
all they need is a high school education. That's a little hard for those of us who got through.
went through that. Yeah, yeah, exactly. But the thing for me that was exciting was like bringing it outside the clinical perspective,
Yes,
and like maybe allowing for these kind of different modalities to come in, right? Because you're
right,
not just trying to treat depression, anxiety, and stuff like that within a clinical medical container. It kind of
yeah,
opens it up into a
right.
new container, and to me that's exciting.
Yes, I agree. But
Yeah,
it's a buyer beware market. You
totally,
have to be very
totally.
careful. But yes, I'm excited about that too, and ways of seeing these medicines as part of different stages of life.
Right, right. Yeah, I've thought about that too. Like, how do we like kind of bring back rites of passages, right? Like maybe into early adulthood, have
Right.
sessions as you're
Right, and
going towards
preparation for death.
her
I mean,
death. Yeah.
that's what the MDMA session that I talked about earlier. It was absolutely a preparation for death.
Yeah, and how has that like I guess like changed your relationship to death? I heard you say that you've had, pretty healthy, but you've had multiple surgeries like throughout the years. And like has that, I don't know, like impacted the way when things like that happen to you? Do you approach that differently?
Well, when I had a major surgery during the writing of this book, and I couldn't concentrate for over a year. My editor was very kind about it, but I just really couldn't even think straight because it was 5.5 hours of anesthesia.
Jeez.
Yeah, it was too much. And it was not cancer, and I'm fine. But yes, I think my experience with the entheogens really helped me go through that with some degree of grace. I can't say I recovered faster. It just time was needed
Needed.
for the
Yeah.
recovery. But my attitude was better because of my entheogen experience.
And I think you shared a story on that podcast too of an older gentleman that got a terminal diagnosis, and all their previous experiences with psychedelics early on might have helped him like confront that a little bit easier than just maybe being in fear and terror.
Yeah, he had a much different. Now he was in his late 40s, so that's much
Oh,
younger.
oh, okay,
That's a big
yeah,
difference.
that's a big difference.
I'm
Yeah.
76. So it's a different attitude. Um, but I think it's how we work with ourselves and work with our own mortality. And there's no question that MDMA session was not an ecstatic heart opening session. It was a very good preparation for death.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think that's important for people to hear too, right? Because I think we like to put labels on and say, oh, this is going to be, more empathic and more
No, you
loving,
never
and
know. There's no
you never know.
guarantees
Yeah,
here. Yeah.
yeah, we never know how the psyche is going to emerge in these
No, it's
sessions.
always a surprise. Yeah.
And we're such a death adverse culture. Like, we don't like to talk about it, and it
Right.
is an important thing. And I always come back. I took this death and dying class during my undergrad, and this is something I try to live by. And it is how we prepare for death is how we live our lives, and how we live our lives is how we prepare for death.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, an important meditation on how we show up on a day-to-day
Right.
basis.
Right. Yeah, that's a good one. I have to say, just even, some of the ayahuasca experiences where I've experienced surgeries during journeys. I mean, visionary surgeries, not real ones, of course, but during an ayahuasca journey, I have felt different surgeries happening.
Mm,
Really, I have no idea what this was about. But I have to say, those experiences helped me when they did. I don't know. I think, the CAT scans and the MRIs that they did. Um, those are big frightening machines, and it's difficult. And having had those experiences, the visionary counterpart to them in ayahuasca ceremonies, I felt like, oh, I know how to do this.
right,
And
right.
so I didn't have any anxiety, and I sort of felt it was all for my higher good, that it was part of what was going to help me.
Yeah.
So I think I in surprising ways, these entheogenic experiences help us in life.
Yeah, they're almost like preparatory tools for life, helping us to show up a
Yeah,
little bit more in different
yeah.
ways. Yeah. I wanted to just ask a question of, like, in the elders that you interviewed and spent time with, how many of them actually took medicines while in ceremony?
Oh, none.
None.
None. I don't know.
That's
No,
interesting to hear, because I know there's some people that are on the side. They need to have at least a little bit to be in the space.
no. If you're really experienced, you don't need it.
Right. Well, what about some of the shamans in, say, South America, where they'll drink a little bit of ayahuasca with folks, or is that a totally
Or
different
a lot of
role, or a lot?
ayahuasca.
Yeah.
Um, that's very different. That's a different ritual, a different culture. That's very different. And there's some traditions where the shaman drinks and the patients don't.
Don't. Yeah. Right.
I did a this is maybe 15 years ago. I did an interesting session that was set up by someone who arranged this. And the man was working on childhood trauma. I was there as the therapist, and I think there were two shaman, a Western shaman in the room, a man and a woman. That's correct. So there were four of us. There were two shaman, a married couple. And they drank, and the patient drank. And I was there as the therapist, so I did not drink. But what the shaman did is he put ayahuasca on my forehead.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, and that was, I know the space pretty well. That was enough to just bring
Get you
me
there.
into that altered space. I didn't feel I needed to drink anything. And the women I interviewed have an incredible fluidity and flexibility between altered states. And many of them had it before they even started working
Start.
with the entheogens. And I'm very fluid as well. And the let me give you there's a psychological term for this, and it's the telogen absorption scale. It measures your responsiveness to hypnosis.
Huh.
So some people are easy to hypnotize, and some people you just can never get them under. And so I'd be easy to hypnotize. And so there's that kind of fluidity between states.
Yeah.
And so the women elders don't need the medicine to go into that space.
It's interesting because I hear a lot of folks like in the underground that love to kind of dose while they're with people because it feels like they're in it with them a little bit more.
I personally would not work with anyone who felt they needed that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel like being sober and being there is very important, and I kind of come from that belief too. And again, right, like maybe it depends on your roles. Like if you're with a friend or something like that, you want to go into each other's
That's
trips
different.
together.
That's
That's different.
that's
Or if
very
you're being, yeah. And I don't know, yeah. And if you come from that shamanic tradition where you want to like you need to be in that space to do some sort of other healing work, like I kind of understand it from that
right, and that's
perspective.
different also. But
Yeah.
for like a psychedelic therapy situation, I would not want to be with anyone who felt they needed that. That means they're not experienced enough from my perspective.
Yeah, and I always come back to a quote that came from Stan, where it's like, your job is really to be a grounding rod, because the participant, the client, whatever word you want to use, is really testing reality. And if you're sitting there kind of giving feedback where reality isn't as grounded, how can that really produce like more fear and anxiety? And so like, how do you really be that grounding rod for people when their
Right.
boundaries are dissolving? And that's so
Right,
important.
right.
So important.
And there's communication that goes on between the person sitting and the person journeying that is beyond just verbal
Right.
and Stan in his writing, he talks about countertransference, and you want to be as clear and clean as possible. Laura Huxley, her quote is I can give it to you exactly. I don't even have to paraphrase it.
Oh, awesome.
The most challenging aspect of guiding is to keep themselves out of their client's journey.
Yep.
So, if you want to do a journey, go do a journey, but that's not psychedelic therapy.
Well, and that's like really interesting to think about. Like, if we're talking about psychedelic therapy, and we'll maybe use kind of like psycholytic therapy as an example, where there is a lot more like interjection there could be.
Yeah.
And like, how do you view that? Like, how do you keep yourself out of the client's experience? Do you actually talk a little bit more? Do you interject as a therapist? Or do you really pull back and have this non-directive approach?
Well, you have to know. I mean,
Right.
that's the intuitive. I'm a big fan of Alan Shore. Uh, a he's integrated a lot of the neurological findings into psychotherapy practice, and he talks about intuition being a key component of what therapists do, and they have to know intuitively what to do, but also what not to do.
Right.
When to keep your mouth shut is important. So, his writings are very important for all therapists. Uh,
How do we cultivate intuition? Like, how do we train for that? Or is that just a natural gift?
I think, I think like basketball playing, the
Partly
NBA.
natural gift.
Yeah, and from years of experience as well. I know I've learned from my mistakes over the
Hmm.
years of practice. That's why 5 years, I don't think made enough mistakes in 5 years. I was still learning, well, forever learning from my mistakes. But yeah, the more experienced the therapist, the better.
Yeah. And I think that's like sometimes the tricky thing with like, and I think this is why apprenticeship is really important. Like just seeing how people are operating. I feel really fortunate that like with my breathwork training, I was able to like really be on the floor, and like, just hear what's going on, how the facilitator is intervening. And I would just walk around and listen.
Yes.
And it's like, how many trainings are out there like that? That
I
you're,
know you've done a real apprenticeship, and I really respect that. And yes, it's very hard to find them, but that is the way people learn. So, what's the best way to become a psychedelic therapist? It's to be a patient with someone who's a very experienced psychedelic therapist.
yeah. It's great advice. Great advice. So yeah,
Hard to find.
yeah,
Hard to
if you
find.
can find it and see if you can really dive in there. Um, and I heard you say in the beginning that like, this idea of integration really came up for you while you're at Esalen. And I wonder, you know, what's your definition of integration? And then also with the elders that you interviewed, how are they viewing integration?
Well, they don't do that much because they're kind of watching a shamanic process of transformation. So it's not about integration for them.
Mm,
And one of my chapters is what the hell is integration anyway? We
yeah.
and so here's my personal perspective. What are we to do with our lives? Make money? That was not my priority, much to
No.
my father's disappointment. That was not my priority. But my priority was to work on myself and to grow and evolve. And so I always think of integration as part of a whole life. It's not something that happens in a couple of sessions. But after these experiences, then what do we do with our lives? And how does that um, how how do we live a more integrated life, and how do our lives unfold? So I remember we were on a panel
Panel.
together,
Yeah.
and yeah, and this one, the lone psychiatrist on the panel in the last few minutes, do you remember this? He finally says, I've done, and he lists all the different therapies he's been in, and finally he's in Jungian analysis. And I chirp up and I say, I've got a Jungian therapist too. And I still have the same Jungian therapist. And here's something I think that I said to her yesterday in a therapy session on Zoom. I said, my my inner sense and my outer life are matching
Mm,
more than they ever have in my whole
that's
life.
beautiful.
And I think that's a sense of integration. I
Yeah.
mean, I feel like my work on this book, I'm doing my job,
Yeah.
and without much attachment, to tell you the truth.
Right.
I'm just doing what's required for this book at this point, and that there's an inner match with what I'm doing in my life. And I
Yeah,
think
it's really
that's
that like embodiment quality, right? Like really feeling
yeah,
what your integrity inside in that inner world and then being able to like really match that with the
yeah.
external
What
world.
I'm doing what I'm called to do.
Yeah. It's important. It's important. And I know sometimes hard to sometimes pin down, and I like how you said
Yes.
like not being attached, right? Because I think sometimes it is a fluid process. It's like sometimes you get on the path, you get off of it. Sometimes, takes you somewhere else, and being open to the journey.
But look at how your life is unfolded from that near-death experience. And so you get, and you're following that. You're not ignoring it and going and doing something
Sometimes
else.
I try to.
Yes, but then you get back on it.
It
And
always
you're,
pulls me back. I'm like, what is
it'll
going on
pull you,
here?
but you respond to it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's that's a little bit of what an integrated life looks like. And then lo and behold, you find people to apprentice with. And so
Yeah.
I think you're a pretty good example of what does it mean to be in that process of integration.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's definitely been a process, that is for sure.
Right.
And lots of ups and downs. And sometimes you feel like you got it figured out. Other times you're throwing your hands up, being like, what's going on? And, but yeah, it is coming back to that like inner pull. It's like, what is calling me, and really
Yes.
trying to develop a relationship with that, and to listen. And then discernment, I think, is a big piece of that as
Yes,
well.
and to live up to it and to have the courage and passion to follow it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what James Hillman is asking for out of psychotherapy, not just,
Right.
not just going over and over and over the same stuff.
Yeah. 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 Are you a fan of Hillman at all, or some of his
No,
work?
I can't
No.
stand reading him, but I think he's very important.
I will say, yeah, some of his writing is like, oh my
Oh
gosh, I
man.
would just go over and over and over again. I'm like, what is he saying here? It's like looping,
Yeah,
and
yeah. But I'll tell you, the book I love is it's a transcription of his conversation with Sonu Shams, who did the Red Book, Jung's
oh,
Red Book.
cool.
He's the Jungian historian, and I forget the exact title, but it's a transcript of their conversation, and they touch on really amazing things, and so it's easier to read than some of
Oh,
his more
cool.
difficult writing. And that's a wonderful book that I'm sure it's listed in my footnotes.
Cool, cool. I am definitely going to try to check that out.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we are a little bit over an hour here. Anything that you feel like you want to close with for today? Anything that's still kind of like churning for you?
No, no, no. Thank you for the interview, though. It's been really fun talking with you.
Oh yeah, it's always fun to catch up and chat with you, Rachel. I really appreciate it. And so, if people are interested, and I definitely highly recommend people to check this book out, where can people find Swimming with the Sacred?
Well, that's the website, swimminginthesacred.com, and it's on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. It's everywhere. But if you go to that website, you can click on to get directly to the Amazon link or the other links.
All right, amazing. So, swimmingwiththesacred.com. That's where people can
It's
check you
swimming
out.
it's in
Swimming
the
in.
oh, and oh, you know what? Yes, there is something I should say, is that the title comes from a song that Maria Sabina would
Mm.
sing, and she's the Mexican curandera who worked with her little saints, her magic mushrooms, and she would sing, "I am a woman who swims in the sacred,"
Oh,
and
that's
that
beautiful.
describes the women elders as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, beautiful. I really enjoyed that title and the context for
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
All right. Well, Dr. Rachel Harris, thank you so much for being here and sharing all your wisdom with everybody. And thank you, everybody, for listening. So we'll catch you next time. Take care.
All right. Bye.